There are conversations where nothing goes wrong, no argument, no tension, no moment you could point to and say, that's where it shifted. And yet, when the conversation ends, you feel tired, not physically, but internally, like something in you has been quietly holding weight the entire time. This kind of exhaustion is confusing because it doesn't come from conflict. It comes from effort, and more specifically, from the effort of staying emotionally on. Being emotionally on doesn't mean you're pretending. It doesn't mean you're being fake or dishonest or inauthentic. It means you're attentive. It means you're tracking. It means you're subtly monitoring how the interaction is going and adjusting yourself accordingly. You notice tone. You notice pauses. You notice when something lands and when it doesn't. You soften statements before they're spoken. You choose words carefully. You keep the emotional temperature steady. None of this looks dramatic from the outside. In fact, from the outside, you might look calm, engaged, even easy to talk to. But internally, you're working. And work, even quiet work, costs energy. What's important to understand is that this kind of exhaustion doesn't happen in every conversation. It tends to show up with certain people, in certain dynamics. Usually, with people where you feel some degree of responsibility for how the interaction goes. Not responsibility in an obvious way. Not because they've asked you to manage them, but because, at some point, you learn that things go more smoothly when you stay attuned. Maybe silence feels risky. Maybe honesty needs to be softened. Maybe neutrality is easily misread. So you stay emotionally present, available, and responsive, even when nothing is technically required of you. That constant readiness is what drains you, not the words, not the topic, not the length of the conversation. It's the background process, the part of you that stays alert, just in case. What makes this difficult to recognize is that you may have been doing it for so long that it feels normal. You don't experience it as effort. You experience it as being considerate, as being thoughtful, as being socially aware. And those aren't bad qualities. They're strengths. But when they're always engaged, without pause, they quietly turn into emotional labor. This is why the tiredness often shows up after the conversation ends. During the interaction, you're on, focused, regulated. Once it's over, your system finally stands down, and that's when you feel the cost. It can feel disproportionate. You might think, why am I this tired? Nothing even happened. But something did happen. You carried the interaction, not in a visible way, in a subtle one. You held space. You maintained balance. You stayed emotionally available. And availability, when it's constant, is tiring. This doesn't mean the other person is doing something wrong. And it doesn't mean you need to confront anyone. Often, the dynamic exists without intention on either side. It's simply a pattern that formed because it worked. Staying emotionally on kept things smooth. It prevented misunderstandings. It reduced friction. So the system kept using it. But what worked for connection may no longer work for your energy. And this is where many people get stuck. They notice the exhaustion, but misinterpret it. They assume they're introverted, or socially anxious, or too sensitive. But the tiredness isn't about interaction itself. It's about overfunctioning inside the interaction. There's a difference between being present and being responsible, between listening and managing, between connection and emotional upkeep. When you're emotionally on, You're often doing all three at once, and that's not sustainable. The shift doesn't begin by forcing yourself to disengage, or by becoming colder, or by withdrawing. It begins with noticing. Noticing when you're tracking the room. Noticing when you're anticipating reactions. Noticing when you're holding space that no one asked you to hold. That awareness alone can be surprisingly relieving because it reframes the exhaustion. It's no longer a personal flaw. It's feedback, information about where your energy is going. You don't have to change the way you communicate overnight. You don't have to stop being considerate. You don't have to become less attuned. But you may begin to notice that not every conversation requires your full emotional availability. That you can let a silence exist. That you can allow a moment to be neutral. That you don't have to keep the interaction balanced all by yourself. When you stop staying emotionally on by default, something shifts. Conversations become lighter, not because they're less meaningful, but because you're no longer carrying them alone. And the exhaustion, the quiet kind that follows you afterward, begins to make sense. Not as something to fix, but as something to listen to. That understanding, that shift from self-blame to clarity, is often where things start to ease.